Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff, where we're continuing our exploration of some of the articles written on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website dealing with the issue of race in Mormonism. Today, we're going to do the second article in the Lowry Nelson saga. If you remember the last episode where we talked about the Lowry Nelson exchange, where LDS sociologist Lowry Nelson wrote to the First Presidency about the issue of the reasons that were being given for the priesthood restriction on black people of African descent. And despite the brethren trying to put him in his place, he responded with a forceful moral and scriptural argument as to why the reasons that had been put forth in the past carried no water, really, and were inconsistent with Christian principles of love and empathy. And he maintained his position. Now, I'm joined together today with Yu-Gi-Oh, who's promised he's going to be good, but I have to keep a steady supply of snacks. So we'll see how that goes. At any rate, if you remember, the thing that originally prompted Nelson to write to the brethren was that an old school friend of his, Heber Meeks, had been assigned to go to Cuba and see if the church could start missionary efforts there. Well, after I found the documents from Lowry Nelson, I began to wonder, whatever happened to the Cuba report that Heber Meeks put together? Did he send it to the brethren? Did they write back? And I was able to locate those documents and get them scanned. And to my knowledge, no one has really written about or published these before. So I scanned them, put them on archive.org, and wrote an article about it. It's probably not the most viewed article on the blog, but I thought that it was really informative as to how the brethren and the people that are closest to them work. So we're going to look at that report today. So let's go ahead and get things set up, and it's going to be just like before, where I'm going to read it to capture it for a future audio podcast, and I may have to start and restart if I flub up words, as I frequently do, and we'll see how it goes. So let's move to the full screen. Here we go. And again, if you go to thoughtsonThingsandStuff.com, you can Google the Cuba report of Heber Meeks and find this article. It's originally published December 20th, 2013. All right, so let's begin. Hold on just a second here. All right, get that turned off. Okay, so the Cuba report of Heber Meeks. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote about the exchange of letters between LDS sociologist Dr. Lowry Nelson and the First Presidency of the LDS Church on the issue of racism surrounding the ban on blacks receiving the priesthood. As far as I know, that was the first time that the whole exchange between those parties was ever published in full. As previously discussed, Dr. Nelson's landmark essay in The Nation magazine started a national conversation about race in the church that ultimately saw a change occur 26 years later. It turns out that there is more. If you recall from the first exchange of letters, the conversation was started when Dr. Nelson's old schoolmate, Heber Meeks, requested his opinion on the cultural and societal status of Cuba. The original exchange of letters was uncovered by examining the collection of papers left to the University of Utah by Dr. Nelson. It turns out that Heber Meeks also left a collection of his papers with Brigham Young University, and a careful search of his collection has revealed more communications. Meeks was preparing a report on Cuba for the First Presidency in order to assess the potential of expanding missionary efforts and church presence in that country. Dr. Nelson's letter in reply to Meeks' inquiry included a probing assessment of church doctrine regarding race and a statement that if the church continues to practice what he termed white supremacy, it would be best if no missionary expansion to Cuba took place. Dr. Nelson CC'd his letter to the First Presidency. I've previously covered the subsequent conversation between Nelson and the First Presidency in detail. Thankfully, Meeks saved Nelson's letter of 26 June 1947, and it can be found in Meeks' collected papers. Bearing Nelson's signature. You can view the full original signed letter from Nelson to Meeks on archive.org. the Cuba Report. Presumably, Meeks continued his research into Cuba and prepared his report without the knowledge of subsequent exchange of letters between Nelson and President George Albert Smith. Gathering information from census data, his own time visiting the country, and input from several academics and government agencies, as well as the feedback from Dr. Nelson, Meeks produced a 15-page report detailing his findings. You can view the report in full at archive.org. Pure white blood. Meeks starts out his report by summarizing his analysis to identify 5 determining factors affecting the issue of Cuban missionary expansion. 1. The number of pure white blood on the island. 2. Is the trend towards the preservation of this pure white blood. 3. Will there be an increase in the pure white blood? 4. Would an injection of our doctrine into the Cuban situation of no racial discrimination be wise? And 5. Should the gospel be taught to the Negro? If you recall from Meeks' first letter to Nelson, he appears to have a particular interest in the concept of pure white blood. One of his first queries is as follows, quote, "Are there groups of pure white blood in the rural sections, particularly in the small communities?" That's a question posed to Lowry Nelson from Heber Meeks in his first letter of 20 June 1947. Nelson's initial response addressed this concept directly when Nelson wrote, quote, "There are no pure races. On this, anthropologists are in general agreement. Of course, this does not mean that Negro blood exists throughout the white race or vice versa. There is grave doubt, however, as to the purity of the Nordic, Mediterranean, or even the Negro." That's from Lowry Nelson's letter to Heber Meeks dated 26 June 1947. Now, Meeks' focus on racial purity of blood may be the result of a personal perspective as to the reasons for the ban on black men receiving the priesthood. He appears to have maintained this focus on purity of blood despite the correction that Dr. Nelson provided. The theme of pure white blood appears throughout the Cuba Report. Other groups have also maintained a focus on the concept of purity of blood and race. The Ku Klux Klan, in particular, condemned the mongrelization of America through interracial marriage. This is demonstrated by a quote from one of their pamphlets that reads as follows, "Purity of the white blood must be maintained. One of the crying evils of the times is the mixture of white blood with that of the Negro. This evil has gone on since colonial days until perhaps more than half of the Negroes in the United States have some degree of white blood flowing in their veins. This condition is not only biologically disastrous, but is giving rise to grave social problems. Mulatto leaders who, under present social conditions, are forced to remain members of the Negro group and who aspire to white association because of their white blood are boldly preaching racial equality in all of its phases. The guilt for this state of affairs rests upon both members of the white race who for a moment of sexual pleasure have betrayed their own kind and bartered their own blood. It has become necessary to devise some means for the preservation of the white blood in its purity, because despite prohibitive laws, racial intermixture is continuing and the problem of mixed blood is becoming more and more acute." This is taken from the Ideals of the KKK. From the 1940s, you can see a scan of that brochure on archive.org. Of course, when talking about the purity of white blood, nobody does it better than our favorite mustachioed artist from Germany. This is from Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. "Blood mixture and the resultant drop in the racial level is the sole cause of the dying out of old cultures. For men do not perish as a result of lost wars, but by the loss of that force of resistance which is contained only in pure blood. And what we must fight for is to safeguard the existence and reproduction of our race and our people, the sustenance of our children and the purity of our blood, the freedom and independence of the fatherland, so that our people may mature for the fulfillment of the mission allotted it by the Creator of the universe." Again, that's a quote from Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. As uncomfortable as it is to acknowledge, on the issue of white blood purity, Meeks' original letter and his Cuba report would fit in very comfortably on a shelf with the doctrine of both the KKK and the Third Reich. How would the First Presidency respond to a report saturated with such elitist, bigoted, and racist ideas? We will soon see, but first it would be helpful to examine the full content of the Cuba report. The white element. In describing the white population of Cuba and assessing its purity, Meeks goes into some detail about how these pure sections document and maintain their purity. Genealogy and segregation. Anytime the purity of blood is an issue, genealogy becomes of supreme importance. This is the means whereby one can document and prove the purity of their blood. This is seen somewhat in the importance of genealogies among Levites who needed to prove their lineage to perform as priests among the Israelites. Genealogy was so important to the Third Reich that SS officers had to zealously research their pedigree back to 1750, and other high-level Nazi Party functionaries had to go back to 1800s. And extensive state resources were expended to microfilm and index birth records, baptisms, marriages, and family trees. Whenever you find a focus on genealogy, the implicit fact is that blood matters. Meeks described how the white Cubans have tracked and preserved their own lineage through social and economic segregation and the strict maintenance of genealogies. From his report, quote, "It was the consensus of the opinion of the authorities with whom we discussed the situation that there are, in Cuba at the present times, approximately 1 million of pure white blood. From these reliable and authoritative sources and from our observations, this group in the urban sections is maintaining a strict segregation from the colored race. Professional, business, and some civic clubs whose membership comes from the above group do not permit membership to anyone with colored blood. We visited at these clubs as the guest of Dr. Romeo Ijemi, and we observed no one who possessed any of the colored characteristics. We were advised that genealogies were carefully checked of all members." This is from the report on the visit to Cuba by Heber Meeks to the First Presidency, dated 23 July 1947. As further evidence of the dedication of the white Cubans in preservation of their pure bloodlines, Meeks included a brief anecdote from the lives of one of the academics he consulted with. From Meeks' report, Dr. Fortran related this incident in his own family, which illustrates how carefully these groups are guarding the purity of their blood. His daughter became interested in a young man from one of the southern provinces who was attending the University of Cuba. Dr. Fortin made a special trip to the boy's hometown, some 500 miles, to check his genealogy. He discovered that one of the boy's uncles was of Negro blood. This ended the courtship. That's a quote from the report from Heber Meeks to the First Presidency. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Dr. Fortin was not a member of the church, and his actions could hardly serve to indict Mormons on racist charges. However, one may wonder why Meeks included such a tale. Was it to show positive proof of a desired trend in the society? What assertion was this story meant to support? Meeks answers this question directly from his report. It was the unanimous opinion of the men we contacted that the lines of race discrimination will be drawn more sharply in the future and on a broader base between this white group of approximately 1 million and the colored element. Also, that the pure white group will increase in proportionate numbers over the colored group. There is a definite trend in this direction at the present time. Now, Meeks makes it clear that these stories and trends support the notion that the purity of the white blood in Cuba is on track to increase among the populace, what Meeks sees as a promising feature of the Cuban landscape: targeted proselytizing. Meeks next turns his attention to the contrast between the church's missionary efforts in South America and the situation in Cuba. He notes that, quote, "The situation in Cuba differs from these countries in that the population is very concentrated and the people of Negro blood are predominant in numbers and have a higher social status and are more active in government affairs. This makes the problem more acute in Cuba. That is the problem of doing missionary work among the white element. It creates a rather delicate situation in making our appeal only to the whites. And that's the end of that part of the report. Here, Meeks is offering a historical insight into something that I had only ever heard as rumor. The idea that missionaries were discouraged or forbidden from actively preaching the gospel to black people prior to the ban being removed. I had heard of this previously, but had assumed that it was an aberration of an overzealous mission president, certainly not something that was condoned as a general rule from the highest levels of church authority. Meeks continues to expand on this problem of excluding the majority black population to focus on the pure white majority and what that may invite. From the report, in my opinion, our opportunity is to work among the approximately 1 million whites. This would, of necessity, be our only approach and our work limited to this group. This would necessitate sending missionaries with a fine educational background who could meet and present the gospel to the professional and business groups of the white race. I believe starting again, I feel there is an intelligent approach to the problem, and if the situation is handled with some finesse and diplomacy, missionary work may be successful in Cuba. Hold on, I have to appease Yu-Gi-Oh! You're going to be a problem child. All right, continuing. Existing Protestant missionary efforts. After covering some basic information about the political makeup of Cuba, Meeks turns his attention to the several missionary efforts which have long been in place by other denominations. From his report, several Protestant churches are doing active missionary work in Cuba. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians have churches in the principal cities. Their activities are confined largely to the urban centers. They maintain schools and hospitals. The Baptists are perhaps the most active. Their most effective missionary work is done by native Cubans. The native Cuban members contributed last year $38,897 to the Baptist Church. They proselyte among the Negroes. No discrimination is shown. That's the end of that part of the report. Meeks then goes on to describe the strong Catholic presence and the cultural attitudes towards existing religions, as well as the educational environment. Contrast Meeks' report with the mission report of the Presbyterian Church as they opened their mission efforts to Cuba in 1899. There is not a single mention of Negro, black, skin, race, or any distinction other than souls which may benefit from the message of Christianity. And you can read the Presbyterian report from the annual report of the Board of Home Missions of the Presbyterian Church, which is found on google.com. The contrast between concerns of pure white blood, which are causing hesitation among the Mormon leaders, and the long-standing missionary efforts already in place by the Protestant and Catholic faiths, is informative. What better demonstration of the differences between a faith's outlook towards all of humanity than the racial discrimination of to whom you bring the gospel message of salvation and peace? Perhaps this simply reflects Meeks' own flawed understanding of God's plan. How will the First Presidency respond? Will they correct his error? We will find out soon enough, but first Meeks turns his attention to the Negro situation as it exists in Cuba. The Negro problem. The Negro problem in Cuba, according to Meeks, is that there is not enough racial segregation. From his report, the Negro situation in Cuba presents a problem. There is no race discrimination other than social with groups as previously stated. They mingle together freely and also show business and political activities. They have intermarried freely. There are not available accurate records to determine who has Negro blood among the average Cuban. And that's the end of that part of the report. Meeks goes on to explain why this diverse, integrated society presents a problem for the church. The problem arises because it presents an awkward social conflict with the church's policy of only actively preaching the gospel to white people. In an integrated society, having to step around the 4 million black and mixed race in an integrated society, having to step around the 4 million black and mixed race populace to selectively convert the 1 million in possession of pure white blood is bound to foster resentment, suspicion, and raise uncomfortable questions about the perception of white supremacy. Since the societal pressures not to preach to black people don't exist in Cuba, Meeks contemplated the possibility of integrated congregations. From his report, in Cuba, there would be no such barrier in proselytizing among the Negroes. The whites and colors would attend the same meetings. They would socialize and all the religious activities. The elders could preside over them and socialize with them. Now, while this appears to be a positive prospect, Meeks points out that the prohibition on blacks holding the priesthood presents a difficulty in such an integrated scenario. Continuing from his report, here the questions arise, and this, it seems to me, is all important. What will the Negro's reaction, starting again, what will be the Negro's reaction in a country where there is no race discrimination to the doctrine that he cannot hold the priesthood and thus be denied exclusive, starting again, to the doctrine that he cannot hold the priesthood and thus be denied executive leadership in the church while his Spanish neighbor may enjoy such a privilege? Would injecting this doctrine into this Cuban situation cause repercussions that may bring the church in disrespect in that country? There may not be political reaction, starting again, may there not be political reaction against such a missionary effort? And that's the end of that part of the report. In summarizing this quandary, Meeks then quotes Nelson's letter, which states that so long as the church preaches a doctrine of white supremacy, it would be a tragic disservice for missionary efforts to expand into Cuba, an assertion which Meeks subsequently categorizes as short-sighted. Meeks' soliloquy. Meeks takes several paragraphs to interject his own musings on the issue by posing a number of questions. First, he muses on whether or not teaching the Cuban blacks about racial purity and their proper status regarding the priesthood would benefit rather than harm them. He states, "We may well ask our question, would it be a tragedy to teach them the truth? Would it be a disfavor to teach them racial purity? Would not the Negro be a happier race if they knew their racial status and enjoyed the blessings of membership in the church, its purifying influence in their lives, without holding the priesthood, than in their present tragic plight in the world? Has not the gospel helped the American Negro who accepted of it? In my opinion, many of the Negroes would accept the gospel and be happy in the church." Then he asks about whether it would be an injustice to keep the whites in the dark about racial purity. Reading from his report, we may ask ourselves the question, are other people entitled to this knowledge? The cursed Negro blood would not be in their veins had they known the truth. What of these 1 million whites? Are they entitled to the gospel? You see, Meeks explains that if these whites knew about the importance of maintaining their pure white blood, then they wouldn't fall into the evil of interracial marriage and miscegenation. Remember that according to LDS doctrine, the resulting offspring would be heirs to the curse and banned from priesthood ordination. In support of interjecting the program of the church and its philosophy into Cuba, despite these concerns, Meeks invokes scriptural and historical examples of Jonah, Amos, Paul, and Joseph Smith himself, boldly proclaiming gospel truths in lands that would seem to carry many disfavoring factors. Concluding his comments, he enumerates the many programs of the church and the real needs of the Cuban people which they would serve, echoing Dr. Nelson's statements about the same. They need a vital religion. The social, recreational, and cultural activities of the church would be warmly received by the people. Conclusion and recommendation. In presenting his conclusion, Meeks outlined 4 reasons that the church should stay out of Cuba. 1. Possible reactions against the church introducing a doctrine of race superiority into an existing condition of race equality. 2. The difficulty of determining the Negro blood, the difficulty of determining the Negro blood in large part of the population. 3. The sins of the people, i.e. mixing white and colored blood through marriage, have denied them the blessings of the gospel. 4. They are of Latin blood, and if opposition arose, local or general, it would be swift, intense, and ruthless. And weighed these reasons with 7 reasons that the church should enter Cuba. First, it is the commission of the church to preach the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Second, there are at least 1 million people on the island who are preserving their racial purity, they are entitled to all the blessings of the gospel. 3, There is a great need for the gospel, the program of the church among the white people. 4. The white element would be responsive to the program of the church. 5. With the right approach, certain Negro elements may respond to the gospel. They have in America. 6. Cuba's nearness to America and an organized Starting again. 6. Cuba's nearness to America and an organized mission would make trial missionary efforts feasible. 7. The responsibility for the gospel not going to the 5 million Cuban people should be upon their own souls, not ours. Now, after covering all of these factors, Meeks makes the following recommendation. Quote, I cannot bring myself to recommend, after days of prayerful consideration, that we stay out of Cuba. I cannot overcome the feeling that these people are entitled to the truth. The First Presidency responds. Now, it's clear that Heber Meeks is a product of his time and culture. By modern standards, the report on visit to Cuba is packed full of racist, paternalistic, and bigoted assertions. These include notions of race or blood purity and superiority. They include condemnation of interracial marriage, identified as mixing blood, which brings a curse upon offspring. They include a justification for withholding the gospel of salvation for reasons of impure or cursed race, as well as trivializing or ignoring the needs of corrupt or cursed races in favor of addressing the needs of white people. Meeks compiled his report and sent it off to Salt Lake City to be reviewed by the prophet and his counselors themselves. How would they respond? Would they take the time to correct this misguided mission president on his theories about race Would they take the time to correct this misguided mission president on his theories about race upon which he was basing his analysis? Meeks soon found out. On the 8th of August, 1947, current prophet and President George Albert Smith sent a letter to Meeks acknowledging receipt of the Cuba report. You can read the full letter bearing the prophet's signature on archive.org. After 2 brief introductory sentences, President Smith immediately points out that Meeks' report seems to rely heavily on Dr. Nelson's responses. From the prophet's reply, quote, we note that you seem to attach considerable importance to a communication sent to you by Dr. Lowry Nelson, that communication bearing the date of June 26, 1947, which apparently was in response to a letter from you to Dr. Nelson under date of June 20, a copy of which was sent to us by Dr. Nelson. That's the end of that introduction. Now, this confirms that the letters covered in the prior article about Lowry Nelson were genuine. And the prophet continues from the prophet's response. Quote, for your information, we quote below a letter which we sent to Dr. Lowry Nelson, covering some of the more important parts of his letter, which he wrote to you. We wish to reiterate to you that the Church cannot view with any tolerance or symptom of approval this idea of the intermarriage of whites and blacks, and therefore all activities which would tend either directly or indirectly to encourage such intermarriages must be carefully avoided by the Church. That's the end of that part of the letter. The remainder of the communication from President Smith is simply a copy of the letter written to Dr. Nelson, which we covered in the previous article. As a reminder, the letter reinforces all of the church doctrine on the curse of Cain and Ham, on premortal unrighteousness in the first estate, justifying black skin and priesthood prohibition, condemnation of interracial marriages, and the fact that these notions are doctrine, which originated from the prophet Joseph Smith himself. Did the prophet correct Meeks' assertions of white blood purity, his prioritization of the needs of white people over other minorities, his exclusion of blacks from gospel teachings? Not in the least. By responding in such a manner, the prophet not only did not rebuke or disavow the contemptible racist statements contained in the report, but he reproved Meeks for not being firm enough in his recommendation against racial intermarriage. Essentially, Meeks wasn't racist enough. Conclusion. Many people may read the original communications between Dr. Nelson and the prophet and the communications outlined here and think that the issue is about race. They would be mistaken. The racism included in this report and all of the responses by the earlier prophets is just the symptom. The real question that is posed by these anecdotes is much more basic. Are prophets inspired of God? This is the same issue that is really underlying prior controversies of the Adam-God doctrine and blood atonement. Now, older prophets have once taught these matters as God's doctrine, and they are now rebranded theories by current prophets and utterly disavowed. Can the church continue to reinvent its past and expect members not to see the implications? P.S. Fundamentals of Following the Prophet. In his 1980 BYU talk, 14 Fundamentals in Following the Prophet, Apostle Ezra Taft Benson outlined the core ideas of how members should relate to the prophet and president of the church. 1, the prophet is the only man who speaks for the Lord in everything. 2, the living prophet is more vital to us than the standard works. 3, the living prophet is more important to us than a dead prophet. 4, the prophet will never lead the church astray. 5, the prophet is not required to have any particular earthly training or credentials to speak on any subject or act on any matter at any time. 6, the prophet does not have to say, "Thus saith the Lord," to give us scripture. 7, the prophet tells us what we need to know, not always what we want to know. 8, the prophet is not limited by men's reasoning. 9, the prophet can receive revelation on any matter, temporal or spiritual. 10, the prophet may advise on civic matters. 11, the two groups who have the greatest difficulty in following the prophet are the proud who are learned and the proud who are rich. 12, the prophet will not necessarily be popular with the world or the worldly. 13, the prophet and his counselors make up the First Presidency, the highest quorum in the church. And 14, the prophet and the presidency, the living prophet and the First Presidency, follow them and be blessed, or reject them and suffer. Now, point 1 makes it clear that any time a member differs from the prophet on a matter of doctrine or any other matter, the prophet is to be deferred to. Points 2 and 3 show a hierarchy of primacy. The living prophet trumps a dead prophet, and prophets trump scriptures. As such, if there is a conflict between Scripture and what a living prophet says, you follow the living prophet against the Scriptures. If there is a conflict between what a living prophet is saying and what a dead prophet said, you follow the living prophet. Furthermore, point number 6 indicates that a prophet does not have to say, "Thus saith the Lord," and points 5, 7, 8, 9, and 10 indicate that a member should follow the prophet in all things, anytime the prophet speaks. Suppose a man disagrees with the prophet on a point of doctrine through a clear, logical basis of reason. Point 8 allows the prophet to defy reason and still be justified. Furthermore, point 11 allows others to condemn that man who would disagree as proud in his learning and pride of wealth if he was unfortunate enough to be rich. If the man persists in his opposition to the prophet and has negative events in his life, then he can be assumed to be paying the price foretold in point number 14. What is a member with a conscience to do? Dr. Lowry Nelson, making the forceful responses to the prophet, may be said to have been in violation of almost all of these fundamentals. History has vindicated him. Subsequent prophets have sided with him. All of these facts make us have to reflect, in particular, on point number 4. The prophet will never lead the church astray. If the church were to ever acknowledge that a prophet had, in fact, led the church astray, then this would invalidate point number 4 as false. This would then invalidate most all of the remaining fundamentals that Benson outlined. Members would be left to consider matters of doctrine on the merits of their own conscience and a personal direct appeal to God without surrendering their judgment to prophets or apostles. If God speaks to men directly and without intermediary through the power of the Holy Ghost, then members should not fear and should welcome this new intimate relationship with God. That is certainly what Dr. Nelson and many others have been doing all along. PPS, ulterius culpan, someone else's fault. Dealing with its racist past has been a challenge for the church. The phrase racist past alone is one that the church still does not acknowledge. The church itself cannot be racist. Members may have been racist, but they have come a long way since the 1940s. The leaders were simply a product of their time. All of these explanations have been proffered by recent leaders and LDS apologists. The church exists upon the basis of doctrine. President Smith, again, in his reply to Meeks, reaffirms that the ban on blacks receiving the priesthood is the result of doctrine, just as he did to Dr. Lowry. Recently, the church issued a statement on race and the priesthood in which it rebranded the doctrines President Smith imposed upon Nelson as theories put together, as theories put forward by prior members and LDS leaders. The statement reads, quote, Over time, church leaders and members advanced many theories to explain the priesthood and temple restrictions. None of these explanations is accepted today as official doctrine of the church. That's from the Race and Priesthood essay on LDS.org. Now, one problem with this statement is that it places blame on the members as well as past prophets. Now, as covered in the prior section, according to LDS doctrine, the prophet is presumed to be correct, and the members must all get in line with that thinking under threat of suffering or excommunication. As such, members should never be blamed by the church for simply following prophetic teachings. For the current prophet to include members in the explanation of prior racist theories is completely reprehensible and smacks of a cowardly desire to spread blame as far and thickly as possible. Members and lower level leaders were looking to the prophets to provide the foundations and justification for any and all of the racist theories that they advanced. From an outsider perspective, these members should be accountable for just going along with such obvious, hateful, poisonous doctrine. However, from an insider's perspective, they were simply adhering to a deeply rooted fundamental of their religion: follow the prophet. Another example with this statement, Another problem with this statement is that it changes what one prophet declares to be official doctrine into a theory. It is understandable why they did this. As discussed in the prior article, renaming the ban on priesthood ordination as a policy rather than a doctrine allowed the church to reverse its course while still maintaining an aura of legitimate authority. So too must this be done to the scriptural and prophetic rationale that justified the practice. Since these justifications were not actions but instead explanations arising from doctrine, then they are termed theories. As before, the blame is shifted to the flawed members and leaders of the past, and the sterling role and authority of the present prophet is maintained. As stated previously, the underlying issue is not of racism. The issue is whether or not men who claim to speak for God actually do or not. These changes on the issue of racism, Adam God, blood atonement, polygamy, and others reveal something about the nature of Latter-day Prophets and doctrine. They do not stand the test of time. How long before the members start to realize that today's prophets and doctrine, accepted as God's mouthpiece and word, are liable to be disavowed and discredited by the prophet of tomorrow? Where then should they place their faith? That will be up to each member, their own conscience, and God to decide. In doing so, they reclaim their own independent identity, free from the shackles of uninspired men. And that is the end of the article. All right. I think I lost Yu-Gi-Oh. Come here, you little twerp. All right, so let's see. We've got some time to take some calls. Let me set that up, and then we'll see what comments happen. Give me just a second. All right, I think we're all set up and ready to take calls. So if you are interested in commenting on what we've discussed here, you can call 210-422-2222 and share some of your thoughts with us. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and take a look at any comments that have come in. All right. Nathan Bigler says, the rule that Mormon missionaries would only proselytize to white people is visible in church demographics today. The church is quite small, with active membership around 5 million, and is not very racially diverse. The church will always have a reputation for having bigoted leaders. All of the current leaders over age 65 or so discriminated against black people until 1978. That's a good observation. You know, it's interesting because even in the world of ex-Mormon activism, a lot of the times activists get criticized because all of these ex-Mormons that are doing stuff, they're all white, and it's a bunch of white guys. Well, some of that is statistical. It's because the church itself is composed of white people. I mean, you wouldn't be if you were dealing with a group of former KKK members, you wouldn't protest that they're not allowing former black KKK people to participate because the group itself was white supremacist. And so, you know, the fact that much of the higher leadership now, because the system of the way that prophets are chosen and maintained in their position, prophets and apostles, we're just going to have really old people. And so you're going to have people with the mentality of decades before instituting policies and procedures for today. And even then, you know, when a younger, relatively younger, in their 60s apostle gets called, he's basically instructed to, you know, bow his head and say yes to the opinions of all of the older apostles until, you know, through attrition, he eventually becomes a senior apostle himself. And so that further delays any real meaningful change that reflects modern societal attitudes. All right. Let's see here. If you would like to add to the discussion, you can call 210-422-2222. I wanted to see if I think it would have been useful. If you go to the article that this is published from, you can see, if you click on any of the source links, you can go and see the source documents, and they include the actual letterhead of the church, the signature of the prophet and his counselors. You know, one of the things, anytime, I know I had this issue when I was first studying church history, you read something and you're wondering, is this real? Is this not just some of those anti-Mormon lies where people are making up crap just to make the church feel bad? And so that's kind of why early on when I started writing for the blog, I needed actual scans of the actual documents. I didn't want to have typescripts. I wanted to see the original source document. And that was one of the weaknesses of the Lowry Nelson exchange that we saw before, was that what you were seeing was a typescript of the letter he actually sent. So a secretary made a copy of the letter that he retained and then sent it to the First Presidency. And so there was always the caveat that you weren't actually seeing the signature on it, so we didn't know if it was really real or not. And the benefit of the Heber Meeks collection is that you're seeing the letters that are sent back to Heber Meeks that are retained, that include the material that we got from Lowry Nelson, and they include the actual signatures, and so you can see that. I think one of the difficulties with coming to terms with the racist themes in the church, when you look at its past history, is like, how did you believe any of these things? And a lot of it is being kept ignorant. And there's an article that you can find on Thoughts on Things and Stuff blog called "Does Church History Matter?" And it asks the question, you know, what if the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, cleaned up its doctrine, cleaned up its policies, cleaned up its rhetoric, and started preaching racial equality? They went and they took all their old pamphlets and they burned them, and then they created new lesson manuals where they took the nice sounding quotes that talked about love and then just redacted any of the other racial quotes. And they started accepting people of all different races into their community support programs, because when you go back and you look at the history of the Ku Klux Klan, it wasn't just some group that walked around burning crosses. It was a social network where people related to it and participated in its activities, not unlike some churches. And so, you know, what if you were born into a family that was of mixed race, and because your family had been kept in the dark about the real history of the group, you thought that you were participating in a really nice, friendly, positive, loving community support group. And only by accident you discovered the true history of that group. You know, if the group was claiming divine sanction for what it did, but you found that dark history, it would call into question their claims of divine sanction. Well, one of the realities that you have to come to terms with when you dive into the history of the church on the issue of race is that if you pull any old KKK pamphlet out, you're going to find a lot of the themes that they were discussing are not unfamiliar to the church back in that era. Themes of white supremacy, of the problem of miscegenation or mongrelization, which are just terms that are used for interracial marriage. And those have been hallmarks of the church in the past. So, coming to terms with the fact that you follow a prophet that holds a mantle that previously taught these ideas that are some of the worst ideas that humanity has ever produced is very sobering. And so it's understandable, I think, particularly when you talk to ex-Mormons, every ex-Mormon will have kind of like a different reason that's the biggest reason for them for why they no longer affiliate with or participate in the church. And for some people, it may be polygamy. For other people, it may be just the deception and whitewashing. And then I think it's going to be one of the big, most common ones on this issue of race. And it's not so much because the church lied. It's what the church used to stand for proves that they do not represent God. Because nobody claiming to represent and speak for God and imposing God's will or God's word on you could, at any time in human history, attribute those things to God and do so legitimately, if you believe in a loving God. All right, so I know it's early and we don't have a whole lot of heads up for this, so I am not getting any calls. There's only so much that I can do to fill the time. Yu-Gi-Oh left me. Yugi! I gave him a haircut, and he looks a little bit like a weasel now. So it's probably good that he stays off the screen. Okay, well, one last chance. If you are interested in joining the conversation, you can call 210-422-2222. And we'll see. I think next we're going to go and look at a letter that was discovered in the records of Stuart Udall. And it was stapled to a note indicating that it was a letter that a lot of people kind of in the underground intellectual circles had been distributing. And it was a letter written by a black man who had grown up in the church. And he wrote the letter to the First Presidency. And he described in terms that I don't think anyone else could articulate and put together. He described what it means, what it actually means to be a black person in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints prior to the lifting of the ban. Because a lot of the times when we discuss the issue, we will say, oh, they were restricted from the priesthood. And it seems like such a trite, minor thing. And maybe if we think about it a little bit more, we might say, well, they were restricted from the priesthood and the temple. And maybe that gives a little bit more implication, but there are so much more consequential repercussions of the priesthood ban that went into the very cultural fabric of the church and what it meant to be a family and to exercise and use all of the so-called blessings of the gospel. It's really eye-opening. And there are a couple of threads around that letter. Number one, we have a sense that the brethren themselves received that letter, and that is because in a later recorded discussion with the president of the Quorum of the 12, he mentions that the First Presidency got a letter from a colored brother in a particular community, and it matches this letter, and it discussed some of the wider implications of the priesthood ban. And I believe that comment, and I'll cover it when we have it, bears directly on this letter. So I think this letter is actually very important when considering the nature and rationale of the change. And we will cover that next time. It's an article called I Too Was Born of Goodly Parents. And that's how the letter starts, and it's very touching. So without any calls, we'll go ahead and close this down today. And until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff.